Welcome to Bhutan Outlook, your reliable source for in-depth insights and untold stories about Bhutan. Today, we dive into a topic that has shaped the nation's history and continues to spark global dialogue: the Bhutanese refugee issue. From the policies that led to their displacement to their desire to visit Bhutan and reconnect with their heritage, we uncover the lesser-known facts and explore potential paths toward reconciliation. Stay with us as we shed light on one of Bhutan's most complex humanitarian issues. Bhutan, a small Himalayan kingdom nestled between China and India, has a population of approximately 700,000. It is home to three main ethnic groups: the Nalampas, cultural elites from the West who practice Tibetan Buddhism and speak Dzongkha; the Sharchups, the largest group in the East, who combine Buddhism with animistic traditions; and the Lothsampas, Nepali-origin Hindus living in the South. Known for its Buddhist heritage, Bhutan prioritizes environmental conservation and gross national happiness as key pillars of its developmental philosophy. In the late 1980s, the Bhutanese government introduced cultural integration policies called Dredglam Namza. These policies aim to bring together the diverse cultures of northern and southern Bhutan under the One Nation, One People policy. At the time, Bhutan seemed virtually divided into two distinct cultural groups with very little interaction between them, which was a major concern for such a small country. To create a more homogeneous population, the policy required all citizens to wear the national dress, go for men and kira for women, speak the Dzongkha language, and follow the dominant northern Bhutanese culture of the ruling elites. The government was particularly concerned about the growing population of Lothsampas in southern Bhutan. They feared that this group's culture and language could overshadow the dominant northern Bhutanese culture and traditions. Historical events heightened these concerns, such as Sikkim's merger with India in 1975, where Nepali speakers became the majority, and the Gorkhaland movement in Darjeeling, which demonstrated how Nepali-speaking communities could push for political power. These events fueled the narrative that Bhutan might face a similar fate, further intensifying the government's anxieties. However, the claim that Bhutan risks becoming another Sikkim is a baseless conspiracy theory used to justify the marginalization of the Lothsampas community. Experts in India and Nepal dismiss this narrative, emphasizing that such fears reflect India's geopolitical influence rather than any genuine threat posed by the Lothsampas. As southern Bhutanese farmers focused on cultivating paddy and livestock, the Lothsampas have no practical interest in crossing Bhutan's rugged, infertile northern terrain. Unlike Sikkim's north-south demographic integration, Bhutan's east-west geography and the localized settlement of the Lothsampas make any comparison invalid. Moreover, this Sikkimization myth diverts attention from Bhutan's systemic disenfranchisement of the Lothsampas, undermining their rightful claims to citizenship. Adding to these concerns, the government also worried about illegal immigration from India and Nepal, further compounding its efforts to preserve the dominant northern Bhutanese culture identity through stringent measures. In alignment with the One Nation, One People policy, the Bhutanese government introduced the Citizenship Act of 1985, which mandated residents to prove their presence in Bhutan prior to 1958 by submitting land tax receipts from that year. This policy built on the earlier decision in 1958 when Bhutan granted citizenship to the Lothsampas as a one-time measure to formalize their status. However, in subsequent decades, the government argued that ongoing illegal economic migration from India and Nepal had significantly increased the ethnic Nepali population, or the Lothsampas, in Bhutan. Those who were unable to provide the required proof of residency from 1958 were classified as non-citizens. These laws predominantly targeted the Lothsampas population, imposing stringent requirements for demonstrating residency and legal status. To understand the evolution of these policies, it is important to examine earlier citizenship laws. The 1958 Nationality Act was a foundational law that granted citizenship to individuals born to a Bhutanese father or those who had lived in Bhutan for at least 10 years, provided they demonstrated loyalty and knowledge of Bhutanese customs. Building on this, the 1977 Citizenship Act tightened the rules by increasing the residency requirement to 15 years for government workers and 20 years for others. These changes set the stage for the much stricter 1985 Citizenship Act, which not only required proof of residence before 1958, but also mandated fluency in Dzongkha and knowledge of Bhutanese culture. Further cementing these policies, a nationwide census in 1988 classified Lhotshampas into 7 categories, F1 to F7, with F1 recognized as genuine citizens, F2 to F6 representing questionable citizenship status or gray areas, and F7 classified as non-nationals. These citizenship laws deeply affected the Lhotshampas community in several ways. First, many Bhutanese nationals were reclassified as non-nationals or assigned conditional citizenship status, as the government considered their status unclear and subject to further verification due to a lack of documentation, such as land tax receipts, to prove residency before 1958. This was often due to illiteracy or unawareness of the need for such records, leaving them vulnerable to losing their homes, livelihoods, and citizenship. Second, families with mixed marriage statuses, where one spouse was a non-Bhutanese national, Indian or Nepali, faced the fear of separation, as some members were recognized as citizens, F1, while others were classified as non-citizens, F4 to F7. Third, internal migrants within Bhutan, who had moved from one district to another, struggled to meet location-specific documentation requirements. Fourth, students were affected as the Nepali curriculum was removed from schools, indirectly forcing them to abandon their culture and adopt the dominant northern Bhutanese cultural practices to avoid being labeled anti-national. These policies created widespread anxiety, with many fearing statelessness, family separation, and cultural loss. The Bhutanese government's efforts to implement its citizenship and cultural policies faced significant criticism due to poor execution and misunderstandings, which led to serious unintended consequences. The government perceived the Lhotshampas, who constituted about 35% of the population, as a potential threat to Bhutan's culture and identity, a fear many now believe was exaggerated. This perception resulted in policies that disproportionately targeted this community. Initiatives like the 1988 census, aimed at classifying Lhotshampas as either Bhutanese or non-Bhutanese, and the Dredglam Namza cultural integration policy were introduced hastily and applied unevenly, leaving the community little time to adapt to the new requirements. Further complicating the situation, many census officials, primarily from northern Bhutan, lacked adequate knowledge about the Lhotshampas community. Their interactions were often marked by rudeness and intimidation, reportedly sanctioned by the Ministry of Home Affairs under Dago Charing's leadership. Families were unfairly categorized, with many declared non-nationals simply for lacking old documents, even if their families had lived in Bhutan for generations. The unclear and heavy-handed enforcement of these policies left the Lhotshampas community confused, frightened, and powerless to defend their status. These discriminatory measures caused widespread suffering and ultimately undermined the unity and stability the policies were intended to achieve. Similarly, certain actions and responses from the Lhotshampas community may have inadvertently complicated their interactions with the Bhutanese government, further intensifying the situation. One key challenge was the lack of unified demands within the community. While some groups engaged in peaceful protests to express their concerns, others adopted militant approaches, enabling the government to generalize all Lhotshampas protesters as anti-nationals or threats to national security. Additionally, some self-exiled leaders from the Garganda Tea Garden shifted their focus from advocating for citizenship rights, human rights, and policy reforms to calling for broader political changes, such as the introduction of democracy. These demands alarmed the monarchy and heightened fears of losing power and control. The government also accused Lhotshampa leaders of being influenced by political movements in Nepal and India, a claim that, while largely unsubstantiated, undermined the perceived legitimacy of their cause. Although the majority of protests were nonviolent, a few isolated incidents of violence provided the government with justification to impose harsh crackdowns on the entire community. These actions, combined with the government's repressive policies, further marginalized the Lhotshampas and exacerbated their suffering. The anxiety caused by these policies deepened when officials enforcing them were allowed to keep part of the fines they collected. This practice led to harsh enforcement measures, creating fear and resentment among the population. Protests began at Sharupsi College in Kunglong, under the banner of the Student Union of Bhutan, SUB, where students organized events such as Banu Jayanti and Durga Puja to express their opposition and demand the repeal of such harsh policies. When protest leaders were arrested, many students fled to India for safety. High school students and some Loth Sampa's officials from border towns joined the movement, forming groups such as the Bhutan People's Party, BPP, and the People's Human Rights Forum of Bhutan, PHFRB. In September 1990, these organizations led large protests in southern Bhutan, demanding democratic reforms and an end to discriminatory policies. While some participated willingly, others, especially farmers and villagers, were pressured into joining. As the protests spread, many fled to India at night to avoid retaliation. Leaders like Tien Risal, who petitioned the king to end discriminatory policies, along with a few of his supporters, were arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment. During this time, several high-ranking government officials fled Bhutan, driven not only by fear but also by a profound sense of moral responsibility.
Dr. Bampa was the first qualified surgeon in Bhutan. Among his patients was the royal family. He could have stayed.
People are attracted to the ideas of royalty. But I thought more of the nation and of the people than the royalty. I wasn't evicted by the king or the government, but when I saw so many people of my country being forced to leave, I chose to leave with them in solidarity.
Many were followed by their families. They felt a duty, as educated members of their community, to stand with thousands of their fellow ethnic community members who had been rendered stateless and to fight against injustice. Those who left were labeled as Nalaps, or anti-nationals, and were stripped of their citizenship and rights. The Bhutanese government sought to shape international opinion by publishing articles in the New York Times accusing protesters of threatening national security. In response, Hari Sharma Timsana, a Bhutanese Loth Sampa student in the US, countered with his own article, exposing the government's harsh treatment of its citizens and highlighting the struggles faced by the Loth Sampa's minority. At the same time, Kanukmani Dixit, a prominent Nepali journalist, played a pivotal role in bringing global attention to the Bhutanese refugee crisis during the early 1990s. Through his articles in the New York Times and Nepali Times, Dixit amplified the voices of displaced Bhutanese communities, shedding light on their plight. To counter these narratives, Bhutan tasked Sonam Thabdan Rabgye, the first secretary of its embassy in New Delhi, with responding to published reports and defending the government's position. Domestically, the government sought to influence northern Bhutanese perceptions by distributing flyers with graphic images of deaths and injuries at border areas, creating the impression that Bhutan faced a serious threat from the Loth Sampas. Additionally, the state-controlled newspaper Quinsel and government-run radio BBS Radio regularly propagated these narratives to reinforce the message. On the other hand, the Loth Sampa issue was covered regularly by the Kathmandu-based radio channel Gatanara Bichhar, which was very popular at the time. Exiled Loth Sampas relied heavily on the channel to expose the truth and share the atrocities they experienced. As tensions grew, the government responded with increasing aggression. Protesters were arrested, their families were targeted, and many were imprisoned. This harsh crackdown added to the suffering of the affected communities and intensified the conflict. After the protests, the Royal Bhutan Army arrested protesters, imprisoned them, and subjected them to severe torture. Many of the arrested protesters were brutally beaten and faced two harsh choices: remain in prison and likely die, or sign a voluntary migration form and leave the country with their families.
पछाडी हात बाँधेको छ यहाँ भुइँमा खाना थुपार्दिन्छ तैँले यही खानु भनेर लेट्रिन भित्र लगेर 11 दिन राखेर साथमा दिनै पछि कुटो च्यापेर यस्तो उसको दुईजना आर्मीले यता पनि थिच्छ दुईटा काठले यसरी कडप्प च्यापेर लो भन्नु भन्छ उसले नभएको कुरो हो भन्न लाउँछ होइन भन्दा झन्सार च्याप्छ अनि त्यसरी गरेर दिनै 7 महिनासम्म त्यहाँ मलाई त्यस्तो दुःख दिएर राखेर.
To escape death and harsh treatment, many chose to leave. While signing the forms, they were forced to smile, and some were given a small amount of money, which the government claimed was compensation for their land, properties, and travel expenses. Once this news spread to other villages, many of their relatives decided to leave the country as well, fearing similar treatment. About 1/6 of Bhutan's population left the country, with a total population of around 600,000 at the time. This meant approximately 100,000 people were displaced. To put this into perspective, in the US, with a population of over 340 million, it would be equivalent to 56 million people leaving. a number roughly equal to the combined populations of Texas and Florida. As the number of exiles grew, the Indian government began redirecting them to Nepal. Experts believe that influential and jingoistic individuals, such as Dago Charing, one of the most powerful government officials in Bhutan at the time, and his colleagues, Dawa Charing and Jigme Y. Thinlay, played a significant role in misleading the young king and exacerbating the situation. One expert remarked, "When I spoke with Foreign Minister Dawa Charing and Home Minister Dago Charing, their responses revealed clear ethnic biases. In contrast, the king came across as rational, articulate, and seemingly more sincere than his officials." These officials are said to have worsened the crisis by intensifying the government's response and mobilizing state resources against the fleeing Lot Shampa population. Now, the key question is, was Bhutan correct in considering the 100,000 Loth Sampas who were evicted or left the country as illegal immigrants? Evidence shows that many Loth Sampas had valid proof of legal residency, such as 1958 land tax receipts and family histories in Bhutan dating back to the 1890s. Almost all of the 100,000 Loth Sampas who were evicted or left the country possessed Bhutanese nationality ID cards issued by the government. However, the Bhutanese government claimed that many of these ID cards were obtained through the bribery of local officials. This claim was used to justify revoking their citizenship and declaring them non-nationals. History will ultimately determine the truth of these events. Perhaps the descendants of Raja Ashti Dorji and his son, Jigme Palden Dorji, Bhutan's first prime minister, known among Loth Sampas as Kumar Sahib, who played a role in settling the Loth Sampas in southern Bhutan, hold the actual story. Their children and grandchildren, now part of Bhutan's royal family, may have deeper insights into this chapter of history. What remains undeniable, however, is that the Bhutanese refugee crisis is one of the most complex humanitarian challenges in South Asia. So, recognizing the complexity of this issue, Bhutan carefully framed its language to deflect responsibility and avoid offering a concrete solution to the problem. Bhutan justified the expulsion of the Loth Sampas by framing it as an issue of sovereignty, cultural preservation, and illegal immigration.
The issue of actually the people in the camps in Nepal is not a typical refugee issue. It's far more complex. It has its genesis in illegal immigration as far as Bhutan is concerned.
The government claimed it needed to protect its unique Drukpa Buddhist culture and Dzongkha language from the perceived threat of the Nepali-speaking Loth Sampas. It argued that many of those expelled were illegal immigrants who had entered after 1958, portraying the expulsions as necessary for maintaining sovereignty, national integrity, and border security.
In late 80s, the southern Bhutan problem and the Ulfa border incursions into our territory in the 90s. It seems for every good thing, there comes a bad omen. Fortunately, the problems caused by the migrant workers in the south began to subside, and the Ulfa border and KLO militants were flushed out of the country.
Bhutan relied heavily on its strong diplomatic ties with India, a key ally and buffer against Chinese influence. India, dealing with its own challenges from Nepali-speaking populations, such as the Gorkhaland movement, chose not to intervene, prioritizing strategic relations.
This is an issue that is bilateral between Bhutan and Nepal. India has no role to play in this regard.
The Nepalese government invited the UNHCR to provide support and granted refugee status to the displaced Bhutanese, offering them basic humanitarian aid. Meanwhile, Loth Sampa's leaders arrested in the early 1990s were released and sent back to Nepal. Leaders like Rutan Gujmer and a few others were freed due to the intervention and support of Amnesty International.
There were two officials, police officials. They were hearing everything we were talking, But at the same time, I was also putting my hand in the back of her body. I wrote AI in the back of my wife's body, thinking that nothing may have happened outside. She kind of told her friends outside that this is what Ratan did all the time. What does it mean? And some of her friends said, maybe he's asking you to contact Amnesty International.
Upon their release, Rutan established the Association of Human Rights Activists Bhutan, AHURA, to continue advocating for human rights. During this time, several high-ranking officials from Bhutan fled on moral grounds, driven by the eviction of their parents and relatives, to support the cause of human rights and democracy in Bhutan. They formed the Bhutan National Democratic Party, BNDP, an exile-based Bhutanese political party, and the Human Rights Organization of Bhutan, HURUB, to raise global awareness about the plight of Bhutanese refugees in Nepal. The government of Nepal took this issue seriously and attempted to negotiate with Bhutan's king to resolve the problem. Despite efforts by King Birendra and Prime Minister Girija Prasad Koirala, Nepal couldn't convince the Bhutanese government to reconsider the situation. Nepal acknowledged that most of the refugees were genuine Bhutanese citizens based on Bhutan's own laws, but its appeals didn't change Bhutan's stance.
What is your government's view of Bhutan's policy of literally forcing out citizens of Nepalese descent?
Those Bhutanese refugees, most of them are Bhutanese nationals, and they are being evicted forcefully.
Do you find Bhutan's policy shocking?
It's of course shocking. As a matter of fact, I'm committed, my government is committed to human rights also. So on the ground of humanitarian ground, we have to look to the Bhutanese problem very sincerely.
Prime Minister Koirala met King Jigme Singye Wangchuk during a SARC meeting in Colombo, urging him to resolve the issue. He also sent Home Minister Ser Bahadur Dubba and Foreign Minister Chakra Bastila to Thimphu for further discussions. Surprisingly, the two key members of Nepal's negotiating team, Minister Dubba and Ambassador Bastila, did not get along or agree with each other. Although both governments agreed to verify refugees into 4 categories, progress stalled after the first verification in the Kadunabari camps. Tensions grew when refugees rejected the categorization of their status, resulting in a minor skirmish that insulted Bhutanese verification team members. While Nepal strongly supported the refugees and insisted they were legitimate Bhutanese citizens, it lacked the geopolitical power to challenge Bhutan.
Oh yes, that is a problem that our two countries have given our highest importance. It is a problem that has defied solution, and there have been very reasons why we have not been able to continue. But under his leadership and the present government in Bhutan, we will continue with our efforts to find a solution, even as we are very appreciative of the international community, in particular the 8 countries led by the United States, to offer a dignified solution, a dignified alternative to the people in the camps here in Nepal.
As a result, bilateral talks between the two countries failed to achieve any meaningful outcomes.
So far there appears to have been really no progress toward solving this issue. Do you think the government of Bhutan is really genuine about finding a solution?
Because the progress is slow, the attitude, you can just conclude what is the attitude of the Bhutanese government. They don't want to solve it very quickly, so they want to just go very slow.
What solution does Nepal want to this problem?
I think that solution is very, very simple. Let us identify who are the Bhutanese citizens and who are not. Those Bhutanese citizens, they should be taken back to Bhutan. That should be the only solution of the problem.
It is now widely assessed by experts that, had Prime Minister Koirala taken a firm stand without yielding to internal or external pressures, this issue could have been resolved during his tenure. The international community had mixed responses to the Bhutanese refugee crisis. Bhutan presented itself as a small, peaceful kingdom working to protect its culture and identity, a narrative that resonated with some nations. While organizations like Amnesty International criticized the expulsions as human rights violations, global attention largely shifted toward resettling the refugees rather than holding Bhutan accountable. Although some countries accepted Bhutan's explanation, Human rights groups condemn the actions as ethnic discrimination or ethnic cleansing. The Bhutanese refugee crisis remains unresolved, even after many Loth Sampas were resettled in countries like the US, Canada, Australia, and Europe. First, around 6,000 to 7,000 refugees still live in refugee camps in eastern Nepal, waiting for repatriation or a lasting solution. Their presence serves as a stark reminder that the crisis is far from fully resolved. Second, approximately 1,000 members of the Sharchups community from eastern Bhutan joined the Loth Sampas cause between 1991 to 1997. Under the leadership of the late Rongthong Khinli Dorji, a well-known businessman from eastern Bhutan, and Thinlay Pinjar, a government officer, an exiled political party called Druk National Congress was formed to advocate for a vibrant multi-party democracy in Bhutan. Experts believe that Bhutan initially supported Rongthong Khinli Dorji's engagement with the Loth Sampas community in exile to prevent the situation from escalating. However, as he established the DNC to campaign against perceived injustices in eastern Bhutan, his actions diverged from his mentor's support. This shift became apparent during the 1997 protests in eastern Bhutan advocating for democratic rights. Subsequently, his arrest in India marked a turning point, significantly curtailing his involvement in exile politics.
The major part of the incidents in 1989 onwards, which has left over 100,000 people totally victimized, stateless. So from this point of view, I would say that if ever Bhutan was a Shangri-La, maybe from the natural environment point of view, Bhutan was a Shangri-La and will remain a Shangri-La. But from the political point of view, I think Bhutan has been a broken Shangri-La ever since then.
Third, resettled Bhutanese communities have established both non-profit and for-profit organizations in the 7 countries where they have resettled. While not always actively engaged in advocacy, these organizations preserve their Bhutanese roots by adopting Bhutanese names for their NGOs and working collectively to maintain their history, culture, and identity. Despite building new lives abroad, unresolved grievances over their forced expulsion and loss of heritage could linger, resurface, and persist for generations to come. History offers powerful lessons on addressing grievances and fostering reconciliation. For instance, Uganda invited Asians expelled during the Idi Amin regime to return, recognizing their invaluable economic contributions. Post-World War II, Germany reconciled with displaced Jewish communities through reparations and acknowledgement of past injustices, while Rwanda successfully repatriated displaced populations after the genocide. Similarly, the descendants of survivors of the Armenian genocide have worked tirelessly to preserve their heritage and seek justice, exemplifying resilience in the face of historic atrocities. On the other hand, unresolved displacement, like in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, leads to ongoing struggles across generations. Perhaps drawing inspiration from these global examples, Bhutan's leadership has made notable strides toward inclusivity and unity through key reforms. Loth Sampas community members now hold significant roles in political parties, including the position of foreign minister, while establishing Hindu temples in southern districts acknowledges their cultural heritage. The restoration of citizenship to stateless individuals since the 1990s reflects Bhutan's commitment to progress, and growing social integration is evident through cross-cultural marriages and the adoption of dominant northern Bhutanese traditional names. However, Bhutan could further enhance inclusivity by introducing Nepali as an optional school subject to preserve the Loth Sampas community's cultural identity and allowing traditional attire during cultural and social events, such as the Sign, Diwali, weddings, and religious ceremonies to celebrate its multicultural heritage. Regarding the refugee issue, the narrative that the issue no longer exists is a dangerous myth, a shallow dismissal of an enduring and unresolved crisis. As the world order shifts from a Western-centric focus to an Asia-centric one, no emerging power in Asia can afford a lingering issue like the refugee crisis festering in its backyard. Bhutan now stands at a historic crossroads. It has the unparalleled opportunity to turn a page and establish meaningful connections with its resettled diaspora. Embracing this relationship is a moral imperative and a strategic step for Bhutan's long-term interests. By addressing this issue with dignity and foresight, Bhutan can position itself as a leader in resolving regional challenges and fostering reconciliation in an increasingly interconnected world. His Majesty Jigme Kesar Namgyal Wangchuk, Bhutan's revered fifth king, both in Bhutan and among the resettled Bhutanese community, could consider introducing a transformative initiative by granting eligible resettled Bhutanese non-resident Bhutanese status with visitation rights on cultural grounds to strengthen their connection to heritage.
बाहिर गएका जो हाम्रा नेपाली भाषी जो लोछम्पा पपुलेसन छ अमेरिकामा छन् क्यानाडामा छन् न्युजिल्यान्ड अस्ट्रेलियामा छन् यिनीहरूलाई एउटा स्ट्याटस दिनुपर्छ देशसँग लिङ्क बनाउनुपर्छ त्यसका लागि सरकारले नि नन रेसिडेन्ट भुटनिज स्ट्याटसको एउटा प्रोग्राम निकाल्नु पर्यो बुझ्नु
जो डाइरेक्ट लिङ्क हो
डाइरेक्ट लिङ्क होस् अब यसमा एउटा अलिकति म अझै फ्रिडम दिन चाहन्छु त्यसमा के भन्दाखेरि नेपाली भाषी गए कति रिसेटल भुटनिज छन् सानोतिनीले उनीहरूले नेपालसँग कनेक्सन बनाउन चाहेको छ भुटानसँग भन्दाखेरि पनि बुझ्नुभयो त त्यसमा जबरजस्ती गरेर उनीहरूलाई लादेर यिनीहरूलाई एनआरबी नै दिनुपर्छ भन्ने पक्षमा छैन त्यो चाहिँ नेपाल र भुटानको नेगोसिएटेड सल्युसनमा आउनु पर्यो
Additionally, addressing the remaining refugee issues in Nepal could permanently close one of the darkest chapters in Bhutan's history. Such visionary actions by His Majesty would mark a historic step toward reconciliation and unity, embodying Bhutan's unwavering commitment to gross national happiness for all its people, past, present, and future. History teaches us that addressing grievances with compassion and vision can heal even the deepest divisions. Bhutan stands at a pivotal moment to lead by example, blending its cherished traditions with progressive reforms. By embracing inclusive initiatives and resolving the refugee issue with dignity and justice, Bhutan can pave the way for unity and a brighter future for all its people. Thank you for joining us on Bhutan Outlook. Until next time, Tashi Delek.